we are still in that space of really justifying what we do, right? And I think if you look at one standard and acknowledge that it gives you a preferential outcome as a manufacturer, and the other test is harder to pass, then most people, I would imagine, would rather commit to testing under a standard they are more likely to pass than commit to a test they think they might not pass. Because at the end of the day, testing is very, very expensive. It's very difficult to get your space in the laboratory at all. And obviously you are committing a great deal of resources to designing and manufacturing ready for that test.
Yeah, there's a number of ways, George, of looking at this, and just to give the background, so the government consulted last year on basically getting rid of all references to BS 476, which is the old, going back to the 70s, I think, standard in the UK. Of course, we're now in Europe, or we were in Europe, so we've adopted the European standards, and there's been in the building regulations reference to both 476 and the European system, and the consultation government undertook was to consider taking out all references to the European standards, and I think that makes a lot of sense for reaction to fire, small scale type testing, more of a room fire rather than a building fire, if I can put it that way. But I'm not convinced, and I think much of the industry is not convinced about the advantages of doing that for fire-resisting systems as well. The differences aren't massive, and some even go towards the negative if you changed. So the impact could be big on smaller companies, on SME type companies, particularly timber fire doors, if they are forced to get rid of their raft of library of tests that they've done over the last 20-30 years. And actually, for what advantage? I've not seen that. I think, as I say, it works for reaction to fire classifications, but not necessarily the right move for fire resistance. And it just complicates the matter. I think it creates more demand on manufacturing when they least need it. It creates more demand on the labs when they're already in demand, as we've said before. I think there needs to be a sensible approach to it. They've taken a step back in the latest building regs and not forced that through yet. But from what I hear, and this is speculation, it is going to come at some point soon. Now, whether that changes post July the 4th, who knows? But certainly the government are minded to get rid of all references to 476, and that's not necessarily going to make a safer building.
I think it's interesting. I did read. I don't know if you've read any of the radar reports, but there are a number of them, and I think there was a really interesting one that I looked at once. I'm showing me geeking out now, Chris, because I found it really interesting, of course. But what I found interesting, they did a comparison between 476 and 1634 Part 1, and looked at how different doors performed. And they took a number of doors. I can't remember. I won't give the listeners the wrong information, right? But you'll be able to go and download the radar report freely and look at it. But the comparison broadly showed that certain door sets would perform far better under a 476 test than they would actually under a 1634 test. And I think although this was not vast, like the differences were not vast, but we were like maybe 10% different. Instead of it failing at 30 minutes, it was failing at 28 minutes or something like that. But obviously, it does breed it breeds that lack of trust in 476, perhaps. And I think in the context of the regulatory environment we are in now, and quite rightly so. Obviously, there is that the Grenfell Tower disaster, and its anniversary was last week. I mean, we are still in that space of really justifying what we do, right? And I think if you look at one standard and acknowledge that it gives you a preferential outcome as a manufacturer, and the other test is harder to pass, then most people, I would imagine, would rather commit to testing under a standard they are more likely to pass than commit to a test they think they might not pass. Because at the end of the day, testing is very, very expensive. It's very difficult to get your space in the laboratory at all. And obviously you are committing a great deal of resources to designing and manufacturing ready for that test. So in a way, I'm sort of on the fence a little bit about it, probably more so than Chris, I think, is that if there is the ability to pass the standard and have the same level of confidence in that test, and one is easier to pass than the other, then I think the more unscrupulous people out there would consider doing the easier test instead of the more complex test. So I don't know, but I think whatever will happen, I think will happen for the right reasons. And I think that if there is a considerable amount of testing that needs to be done because doors can no longer be certified if they were burned under a 476 test, then that is just going to exacerbate the capacity issue in the testing market. And I think the point Chris is making, and for what? What benefit does that truly bring other than monetising and monopolising testing at a time when there isn't any capacity in the testing industry? It's a max out industry all day long.
The industry does not need that added complication. It's got enough to deal with to save 2 or 3 minutes either way, and it's an arbitrary 30 minutes anyway.
Yes.
60 minutes. So do you really need 30 or 60 minutes when you're escaping a building?
And I think in the market, obviously the FPA are in the fire risk assessment market, and CLM fireproofing as a specialist contractor in the remediation market, working with social housing clients and working with hospitals. I know full well that if there is a question mark around 476 testing and a demand for 1634 Part 1 testing, then we're all of a sudden going to be in a question with large organisations saying, well, all of my doors are to BS 476 and I've got 150,000 of them. What do I do about those? And, there are a lot of people who say, well, you just need to replace them all with brand new door sets then, because, 476 is no longer a legitimate test in the UK. And obviously we would all look at each other and shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's simply not the case. Right? It's just that, so I think there is an issue in that. There will be a problem whereby owners of large multi-site organisations will question their own fire doors just because the government have changed their mind about whether or not 476 testing or 1634 Part 1 testing is the right standard for a door set.
You were saying earlier, and I think it was the Radar 1 report you were talking about, where they tested these doors to different standards and compared the differences. Does that mean that we fully understand the differences between the two, and does that mean that an assessment would be possible for someone to say, okay, it's been tested to 476, here's the test report, or are they too different?
I ran the tests, George, back in the day, so I can remember them fairly well. I can remember the differences, and some were marked, but some were big differences, some were insignificant differences. Yeah. Or as Tom said, actually the other way, it performed better and there's so many variables in a fire test, not least in the specimen, how it's put together, how it's installed. That variability, if there are a few minutes, we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't kill the industry and think just for those few minutes. It really doesn't matter.
No, I agree.
There are some products that will suffer quite a lot, and it was agreed within various organisations not to do that assessment, to go from 476 to EN because of the unknowns, because of the variability. It was probably a lab decision to do that, if I'm honest. But yeah.
It's also quite interesting. I mean, if you think about the conversation we've just had around, CE marking going and UK CA marking coming in, yet we're going to have a drive to lose a British standard in favour of a European standard for fire doors that we will then want. To me, there is a big problem around that, and I think that actually, in my mind, the right solution, if the direction of travel is less about European conformity and more about UK-centric conformity with the UK CA mark, for example, that's the direction of travel, then surely we've got the ability to just create a new version of BS476 and build on it rather than throw it out and you replace it with an EN standard.
Tom, the difficulty is big business that make
of course.
products all across Europe and export all across Europe. They want to do a test to one standard and to one set of compliance. Okay, it might be a different performance requirement in Germany compared to the UK, but it's still fundamentally doing the same job and tested to the same specification, to the same test method. And I can see that argument against keeping the British standard.
Yeah,
and actually, for CA marking, it's a political decision. It adds no technical value, doesn't make any products safer. It was almost two fingers to Europe. You're taking away our ability to use CE marking properly. So we're going to invent our own mark, and it's wrong. It doesn't add anything to safety. Not the way it's built. If we want to take back power, make CA marking properly mean something for the UK and write the standards around it to mean for the UK, then fine, let's do it. But that doesn't suit business to do that, manufacturers anyway.
Because I think there's a concern, even with doing the same test, like you say, you can test in the UK, but there seems to be a concern as to, particularly with fire resistance testing, as to how you could export that to Europe. And get it approved and certified in Europe when it's been tested in the UK.
We're in the crazy situation where we will accept European tests. Our compliance bodies will accept European tests or tests done in Europe, but the Europeans won't easily accept ours. So how is that helping UK PLC? I mean, it really doesn't, at least not in the compliance area. So we need to get that right, and the CPA and Construction Leadership Council are fighting hard, lobbying hard to, and quite rightly, I think, to have some sensible discussions in that area. It might change after the election.
Yeah, okay. I do want to move on a bit, and Tom, you touched on timber earlier and sort of modern methods of construction in general, and how old these standards are. I mean, 476, I said, is I think 70s, and the European standard is quite old itself and based on similar principles. Are they still appropriate for these modern methods of construction and timber? And does more work need to be done?
Well, I mean, in short, no, I don't think so. I think, and again, Moral Day report said innovative products have accelerated beyond the capability of standards and tests to keep up, right? And I think, having been through the process of attempting to do fire resistance testing in cross-laminated timber and mass timber buildings, the reality is that you are basically creating your own test. You're inventing your own test to give you enough data to allow you and your experts around you to come out with the right proportional approach to a reasonable amount of safety as described within the building regulations. I think that the cleverer we get, the harder we've got to work to bring testing along with the journey. And I think that construction innovation is so well funded, and actually the testing regime and the documentation that will support that is so poorly funded, actually, that you find that I believe that gulf will get larger, not smaller. And I think whilst the Moral Day report talks about this and the fact that innovation has already done that with testing, has outstripped its ability to keep up, I don't really understand how we slow that down, because the innovation is big business, and it's about how do we build things more efficiently, with better carbon footprint, obviously more profitably as well. There is a drive to do that, and I think the answer to the question is unanswered. I don't think there is an answer to solving that. The only way in particularly innovative solutions you can get anywhere near to it is to really double down on competency, and really invest in the right people to experience testing, if they are the sort of people that are going to create tests because at the end of the day, you've got a fire engineer that wants to build a building out of cross-laminated timber, and they've got no experience in testing. They understand how fire works and fire engineering works, but they say, right, the sort of test I want to see is X, so I'm going to design that test, and then I want you to monitor the test and give me all the outputs for toxicity and for temperature, and this is the size of fire I want. You get the results, but the question I would ask is, was that person competent enough to dictate the test? That becomes a big issue as well. And I think, when you think about the hollowing out that as described in that report, the hollowing out of capability in the UK around testing because of the European testing harmonisation, then actually how do you improve the competency and the knowledge of what sort of tests should be used in certain novel conditions? It's very easy to test things in a wall scenario in a vertical furnace to a standard, but was that the right standard for that construction product? And that requires a level of expertise, right? And so I'm not convinced we are there yet. I don't know what the solution is, but I think testing standards will need to dramatically change to keep up pace with the novel building products and the novel building scenarios that we are seeing being implemented on the street daily.
Yeah, I think you've sort of touched on different people with different competencies there as well. Sort of fire engineers who are competent at the engineering side of it, and fire test houses, and the people with experience of testing, experience of that, and possibly more collaboration between them is one of the solutions.
Yeah, just really quickly, George. Thanks. Yeah, just it strikes me that the landscape Tom's talking about, where there's a dearth of proper tests being done on these innovative systems and buildings, it would have been funded in the past, and there would have been research money to do that, probably from government. And that was around when I first got into fire testing. What was it, 5 or 10 years ago? Wasn't that long ago. But nowadays, it's hard to get that type of money, and the FBA is part of a couple of consortiums to ask various bodies for that money, but I don't know that it's readily available. Well, it isn't readily available, and I think that's what we're missing, that kind of research pot to look at these new buildings from many aspects, fire just being one of them. Yeah.
To be fair, I can give you a good example. One of the companies I worked for before, we invested £500,000 in a very, very specific test to look at something very, very specific around cross-laminated timber. And, we must have had, a team of 5 or 6 people looking at the test and designing the test and considering load. And, it was witnessed by, building control. It was witnessed by the fire engineer. We even had the fire brigade witness it. The client witnessed it, and I remember the outcomes of the test were as we wanted them to be. The test did do what we thought it would do, and it demonstrated nicely what we were trying to demonstrate. And when someone said to me, "Oh, Rick, so who sponsored it?" I said, "Oh, well, the client sponsored it," and he said, "Well, of course it passed then." And immediately there's an element of people distrusting the results of certain tests because of who sponsored it. And actually, when there is no innovative budget coming out of government, no centralised pot, like Chris said, well, the people that need to spend the money on the test are the people that benefit from the results, of course, because otherwise, why would you bother to sponsor one? I think the only way, interestingly, that and I'm talking about timber a lot. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it's just because it is an innovative, an innovative use of a product that is very topical, particularly from a fire perspective. But I think that there are organisations. The Structural Timber Association, for example, did put together a budget and a list of fire testing that it wanted to do to support the utilisation of mass timber globally. And they had a lot of the main developers and a lot of the main timber manufacturers putting a large pot of money together under the Structural Timber Association. And then there was a fire engineer that was engaged by them to basically create 1 through 10 list of tests that would be really beneficial for fire engineers to be able to utilise timber, which was a great idea. And funnily enough, as soon as they start passing tests, you then say, so, all right, so who funds the STA? And then you say, well, hang on, so again, someone's got to come up with the money. It's got to come from somewhere. So I think that the problem is the scrutiny element of who's paying for what test is problematic.